Have you ever tried to fall asleep while machines scream inches from your face, knowing the bell will drag you back in before dawn? Tonight, you step into a Victorian factory where time is stolen, bodies are spent, and sleep is a rare luxury, if it comes at all. Hey guys, tonight we walk straight into the dark heart of a Victorian factory, and you feel it before you see it, the vibration in the floorboards, the heat pressing against your chest, the way the air hums like it's alive. You stand at the threshold as iron machines thud and spin, belts slapping overhead like restless snakes, and you already know something important. This place does not care if you are tired. You probably won't survive this on a modern sleep schedule, and frankly, neither did many of the people who worked here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside, and the night shift swallows you whole. The first mainstream fact hits immediately. Victorian factories often ran 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and sometimes more when orders piled up. The idea of an 8-hour workday is still a radical fantasy, something whispered by reformers and laughed at by owners. You feel your shoulders tense as the foreman's gaze flicks over you, measuring not your comfort, but your output. You learn quickly that fatigue is not an excuse. It's just another condition, like damp air or low light. The machines dominate everything. Steam-powered looms and spinning frames roar so loudly that conversation becomes a game of exaggerated lip-reading. You shout a greeting, and it vanishes into the noise, which is how you discover your first coping strategy. You stop trying. Workers here develop a factory-specific body language. Shrugs, nods, quick hand signals, because shouting all day is pointless and exhausting. Historians still argue whether this constant noise caused more long-term hearing loss than battlefield cannon fire of the same era. But standing here, ears ringing, you suspect the answer isn't comforting. The floor beneath you is slick, not from water, but from oil, grease, and years of embedded grime. You plant your feet carefully, because slipping means falling into moving machinery, and that's a story nobody wants told at bedtime. Still, accidents happen often enough that they blur into routine. A quirky tidbit circulates among workers. Some believe wearing a red thread around the wrist wards off machine spirits. You don't know if you believe in machine spirits, but you notice a lot of red threads. You glance at the windows and realize they're mostly sealed shut. This is deliberate. Fresh air might rust metal, owners say, or disrupt temperature-sensitive processes. The result is an atmosphere thick with cotton lint or coal dust, depending on the factory. You inhale, and the air tastes faintly sweet and bitter at the same time. Your lungs already feel coated, like you've been breathing through fabric. Workers joke being a generous term, that this is factory perfume, and that it saves money on cologne. That's joke number one, and it lands with the thud of a coping mechanism rather than a punchline. Time behaves strangely here. Bells dictate your movements with religious authority. Start, stop, eat, return. Before factories, many people worked by daylight and task completion. Now, time is chopped into sharp-edged units, enforced by clocks mounted high on walls. You catch yourself checking the clock constantly, even though it seems frozen. This is another mainstream historical reality. Industrialization didn't just change work. It reprogrammed how humans experience time. Minutes become something you endure rather than live. You notice children weaving between machines, small enough to slip into spaces adults can't reach. This isn't shocking yet. Shock comes later, but it unsettles you. Child labor is normalized here, defended as character building and economically necessary. A fringe detail whispers through the room. Some parents believe factory noise toughens children, making them less likely to be startled by life. You look at a boy barely taller than the spinning frame he tends, and you wonder what kind of life requires that kind of preparation. The foreman claps his hands sharply, and everyone snaps back into motion. You realize discipline here is less about cruelty and more about rhythm. Miss the rhythm and you risk fines, docked wages, or worse, being fired and replaced within the hour. There is always someone outside the gates. Historians still argue whether this system was inherently exploitative or simply an inevitable phase of economic transition. But standing among these machines, inevitability feels like a convenient excuse. Your body reacts before your mind does. Shoulders hunch. Jaw clenches. You breathe shallowly to avoid the worst of the dust. You understand why workers develop a peculiar gait, half-braced, half-resigned, as if expecting impact at any moment. Someone near you mutters that the machines can smell fear. That's joke number 2, delivered deadpan, and you almost laugh before remembering that fear here is rational. As the hours stretch, you feel hunger creep in, dull and persistent. Meals are brief and functional, eaten standing or sitting on the floor. You learn that tea is the great industrial lubricant, not for machines, but for people. Strong, bitter tea dulls hunger and keeps eyelids open. There's a rumor that some factories add chalk or other fillers to bread to make it cheaper. Whether true or not, it tastes like survival rather than nourishment. You glance again at the clock, and this time it has moved, but only slightly. Relief and disappointment arrive together. You begin to understand the dark sleep part of this story, not just literal night work, but the way exhaustion becomes a permanent background state. Sleep is fragmented, stolen in short bursts between shifts, and often interrupted by dreams of spinning wheels that don't stop when you wake. A worker tells you that if the machines ever go quiet in your dreams, you should worry. That's joke number 3, soft and unsettling. As the shift grinds on, you sense the emotional landscape of the factory. Resignation layered with quiet pride. There's skill here and speed, and a strange satisfaction in keeping pace with relentless systems. You realize this is why the story is complicated. Industrial brutality coexists with innovation, opportunity, and the beginnings of modern life. Historians still argue whether workers felt more trapped or more hopeful during these early decades, and the answer probably changes from person to person, hour to hour. When the bell finally rings, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a pause. You step back toward the door, ears ringing, lungs aching, body humming in time with machines that continue without you. Outside, the night air feels impossibly quiet, almost suspicious. You know you'll be back soon because survival demands it. And as you walk away, you carry the factory with you. Its noise, its rhythm, its stolen hours, already settling into your bones. You step back in time just a few decades before the machines fully take over, and the contrast is subtle at first. Work still exhausts you, but it follows a different rhythm, one set by daylight, seasons, and the slow agreement between body and task. This is the world many Victorian workers remember, or imagine remembering, before factory bells begin shouting orders. The mainstream fact here is simple but enormous. Before industrialization, most labor is task-based rather than hour-based. You work until the job is done, not until a clock tells you to stop. You picture yourself in a small workshop or cottage, hands busy but mind quieter. The light fades and work naturally slows. There's no overseer checking a stopwatch, no penalty for pausing to stretch your back. It's not easy, manual labor rarely is, but it's yours in a way factory work isn't. You feel ownership over the pace, if not the outcome. That sense of control turns out to be fragile. You notice how sleep fits differently into this older world. Night is for rest, mostly uninterrupted, and even when worries creep in, they don't arrive with the mechanical precision of a shift schedule. People talk about first sleep and second sleep, waking briefly in the middle of the night to pray, think, or just exist quietly before drifting off again. A quirky tidbit floats through the scene. Some households believe this midnight waking is the best time for problem solving and even romance, because the mind is loose and unguarded. You smile at the idea, because it feels almost luxurious compared to what's coming. Then the edges begin to change. You hear about new mills opening near rivers, promising steady wages instead of uncertain harvests. This is the hook that draws people in. Regular pay sounds like security, especially if you've ever watched crops fail or orders dry up. Historians still argue whether early factory workers felt they were escaping hardship or trading one kind of suffering for another, but hope is a powerful recruiter. You can feel it tugging at you. Time starts to tighten. Employers introduce clocks not just as tools but as authorities. You sense the first theft, not of money, but of flexibility. Workdays stretch longer because artificial light makes it possible. Candles and gas lamps blur the boundary between day and night, and suddenly, after dark stops meaning after work. You laugh softly when someone insists this is progress. That's joke number 1. A dry laugh at optimism that ignores biology. You watch communities shift. Where neighbors once coordinated tasks informally, now they coordinate commutes. Streets fill at dawn with bodies moving in the same direction. Heads down, lunches packed. There's camaraderie here, but it's thinner, stretched by fatigue. You overhear older workers complaining that young ones don't know how good they had it before machines. This is comforting. In a way, every generation believes the last one ruined everything. You feel the loss of skill autonomy. In pre-factory life, mastery matters. You know your tools, your materials, your limits. In early industrial settings, tasks fracture into smaller motions, easier to teach and harder to own. You perform the same movement hundreds of times a day. The work no longer needs your judgment, just your endurance. Someone jokes that thinking too much slows production. That's joke number 2, and it lands because it's uncomfortably close to policy. Sleep begins to suffer first. You try to rest, but your body hasn't learned the new schedule yet. You lie awake, muscles buzzing, mind replaying repetitive motions. This is a documented reality. Early industrial workers report insomnia, strange dreams, and chronic exhaustion long before medical language exists to describe them. You realize that dark sleep isn't just about night shifts. It's about sleep that never fully restores. You hear debates brewing even now. Clergy warn that endless work erodes moral life. Factory owners counter that idle hands invite vice. Reformers argue for limits. Economists argue for output. Historians still argue whether early resistance to factory timekeeping is rooted more in health concerns or in cultural identity, but standing here, you feel both pulling at you. A fringe belief circulates quietly. Some workers think machines steal vitality, not metaphorically, but literally. They claim you age faster near spinning frames, that iron draws something essential out of flesh. You don't fully believe it, but you notice how young some workers look old. You touch your face, half expecting to feel time slipping through your fingers. Meals shrink and simplify. Eating becomes refueling rather than social ritual. You remember long dinners and shared stories, and you miss them more than you expected. Someone claims chewing too slowly is a sign of laziness. That's joke number 3, absurd enough to sting. You start to see how inevitability is manufactured. Each small change seems reasonable. Longer hours here, stricter timing there, until suddenly the old way feels impossible to return to. People move closer to factories, restructure families around shifts, teach children punctuality before they teach them play. This is how a system settles into bones without asking permission. As night falls, you sense the coming rupture. The factory world isn't fully here yet, but it's close enough to cast a shadow. You feel caught between two times, one fading, one accelerating. The quiet of evening feels temporary, like a borrowed blanket that will soon be taken back. You lie down, hoping for deep rest, and instead hover between sleep and wakefulness. Your body knows something is wrong, even if your mind can't name it yet. Tomorrow, the bell will ring and you'll answer. Not because you're forced, at least not yet, but because the world is changing and standing still feels like falling behind. You notice the children before you fully register them. They move differently, quicker, lighter, slipping through gaps between machines with a kind of practiced alertness that adults no longer possess. This is where your stomach tightens. The mainstream historical fact is unavoidable. In Victorian factories, children as young as 5 or 6 are commonly employed, especially in textile mills, because their small bodies fit where adult ones cannot. You watch a girl dart under a spinning frame to retrieve fallen cotton, and you realize the machines never slow down for her. You stand close enough to hear her breathing, quick and shallow, perfectly timed to the rhythm of gears. No one has taught her to do this. She's learned it the hard way. Children here don't just work, they adapt. You feel an uncomfortable admiration, immediately followed by guilt for feeling it at all. This place reshapes instincts early. You learn the job titles whispered among workers. Scavengers, piecers, doffers. Names that sound almost playful until you understand them. A scavenger crawls under moving machinery to collect loose fibers. A piecer ties broken threads at high speed. A doffer removes full bobbins and replaces them with empty ones, running constantly to keep up. These are not apprenticeships in the romantic sense. They're survival roles. Sleep deprivation shows first in the eyes. You see it in the way children blink too slowly, as if their eyelids are heavy doors. Many work 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, and then walk home through dark streets before doing it again the next day. Historians still argue whether factory work was worse for children than agricultural labor, but the key difference presses on you now. Fields don't roar, and crops don't pull hair or fingers into iron teeth. A quirky tidbit floats through the room. Some factory owners genuinely believe constant work keeps children out of trouble. Idleness, they argue, leads to crime and moral decay. You almost laugh. That's joke number one, a bitter one, because the idea that exhaustion builds character feels like something invented by someone who sleeps well. You watch a boy wipe his nose on his sleeve, leaving a gray smear of lint and oil. There's no time for hygiene. Injuries are frequent and often unrecorded. Cuts, crushed fingers, scalped hair. These are treated as inconveniences unless they stop production entirely. You hear a worker mutter that machines are hungrier than children. That's joke number two, delivered quietly, and it lands like a truth disguised as humor. Education exists here in theory more than practice. Laws requiring schooling are unevenly enforced, and even when classes are offered, fatigue wins. You imagine trying to learn letters after 14 hours of noise and repetition. The mind shuts down to protect itself. A few reformers push for half-time systems, work half the day, school the other half, but implementation is spotty and enforcement weaker still. You feel anger rise, then stall because it's complicated. Families rely on children's wages. Without them, rent doesn't get paid, food doesn't appear. Parents face impossible choices, and factories exploit that pressure expertly. Historians still argue whether parents are victims or collaborators in this system, but standing here, you see desperation more than cruelty. The children develop their own microculture. They trade tricks for staying awake, like chewing on scraps of cloth or tapping rhythms against metal. Some swear by superstitions, touching iron 3 times before starting a shift, or never stepping on cracks near machines. One child claims the machines listen and behave better if you greet them politely in the morning. You don't know whether to smile or shiver. You notice how punishment works. A child who slows down might be fined, struck, or sent home without pay. Physical discipline is normalized, justified as necessary correction. The emotional discipline is worse, constant reminders that you're replaceable. You see a small boy flinch when a belt snaps overhead, and you realize flinching costs time. He forces himself still, and something in you breaks quietly. You think about growth. These children grow up bent, shoulders forward, spines shaped by repetition. Some doctors of the era begin to notice deformities and stunted development, but their warnings compete with profit margins. The factory always wins. Someone jokes that machines teach posture better than parents. That's joke number 3, and you hate yourself a little for smiling at it. Yet even here, there are moments of softness. You see an older worker sneak a crust of bread to a girl who looks faint. You hear whispered songs, half-remembered lullabies hummed just loudly enough to be heard over the machines. These small rebellions don't change the system, but they keep people human. Night shifts are the hardest. Children struggle to stay awake, heads nodding dangerously close to moving parts. Candlelight throws long shadows that make machines look alive, looming and predatory. Some children later describe nightmares where the factory chases them through sleep. You don't need convincing. You can already feel it creeping into your own dreams. Reform movements gain momentum precisely because of scenes like this. Reports, testimonies, and illustrations circulate, shocking the public. But even then, outrage competes with convenience. Cheap cloth, cheap goods. Someone has to pay the price. Historians still argue whether reforms come too late to matter for a generation already damaged. But incremental change begins to flicker. You look again at the children and realize they're not the future promised by industrial progress. They're the cost. And costs in this era are meant to be minimized, hidden, justified. You feel the weight of that logic pressing down, heavy and cold. As the shift drags on, you feel an urge to protect, to intervene, but you're trapped by the same system. You're just another body inside it. When the bell finally rings, children spill out alongside adults, equally exhausted, equally quiet. There's no separating innocence from labor here. It's all blurred together in oil and dust. You step outside with them, and the night air feels too big, too empty. You watch small figures disappear into alleys and narrow streets, heading toward brief sleep before it all begins again. You stand there longer than you should, knowing that tomorrow they'll return, and the machines will be waiting, patient and unashamed. You begin to understand that the most powerful machine in the factory isn't made of iron at all. It's time. Not the slow, flexible time of sunrise and seasons, but a sharp, measured thing that slices your day into punishable units. The mainstream historical fact settles in. Victorian factories help standardize clock time, turning minutes and seconds into commodities. You don't just work, you account for yourself constantly. You hear the bell before you see it, a metallic sound that cuts through everything else. Tells you when to arrive, when to eat, when to leave, and it does so with absolute authority. Arrive late, even by a few minutes, and wages are docked. Leave early, and the same. There's no such thing as almost on time. You feel your pulse sink to the schedule, heartbeats lining up like obedient workers. Before this, many people live by what historians call task time. You finish what needs doing, then you rest. Now, rest is rationed. Lunch breaks shrink to just long enough to swallow food. You catch yourself eating faster than feels natural, jaw aching as you rush. Someone jokes that chewing slowly is a luxury for the wealthy. That's joke number one, and you nod, mouth full. Sleep begins to fracture. Shifts start before dawn or run deep into the night, and your body never quite knows where it stands. You lie down exhausted, only to wake again hours later, disoriented, unsure whether it's morning or evening. This is documented even if the language is new. Workers complain of nervous disorders, irritability, and a constant sense of unrest. You recognize it instantly. It feels like living in permanent jet lag. The factory clock becomes a source of anxiety. You glance at it compulsively, even when you can't afford the distraction. Time slows when you're tired, stretches into something almost cruel. Historians still argue whether this psychological strain is intentional discipline or an unintended consequence of efficiency, but intention hardly matters when you're living inside it. A quirky tidbit circulates. Some workers believe clocks lie. They swear the foreman speeds them up during busy periods. There's no proof, but the suspicion itself is telling. Trust erodes when time becomes a weapon. You find yourself squinting at the hands, willing them to move, accusing them silently when they don't. You notice how punctuality becomes a moral value. Being on time is framed as virtue, lateness as personal failure. This shift seeps into language, sermons, even parenting. Children are scolded not just for misbehavior, but for wasting time. You feel the pressure to justify every moment of your existence. The bell rings for meals, and you sit wherever you can, often on the floor. Conversations are clipped, half-finished. No one wants to waste breath or seconds. You realize how this changes social life. There's less lingering, less storytelling. Silence becomes efficient. Someone remarks that silence is cheaper than conversation. That's joke number two, soft and bleak. Night work introduces a new cruelty. Artificial light tricks the body into staying alert, but only just. Gas lamps flicker, casting shadows that make machines look like moving creatures. Your eyes burn and your head throbs. You understand why some workers fear night shifts more than dangerous tasks. It's harder to stay awake than to stay careful. You think about sleep as something stolen in fragments. Workers nap in chairs, on floors, against walls. Sleep becomes shallow, easily broken by noise or anxiety. Historians still argue whether chronic sleep deprivation played a larger role in accidents than mechanical danger itself, But watching eyelids droop near spinning gears, the answer feels obvious. A fringe belief emerges. Some workers swear that sleeping immediately after a shift is dangerous, that the body needs time to cool or risk illness. Whether superstition or early intuition about stress, you see people pacing before bed, too wired to collapse. Exhaustion doesn't always lead to rest. Sometimes it leads to restless wakefulness. You feel time invading even your dreams. Bells ring there too, pulling you awake just as you begin to drift. You laugh quietly at the thought that at least in dreams you're still employed. That's joke number 3, and it's thin but necessary. The standardization of time ripples outward. Train schedules, school hours, shop openings, all align with factory clocks. Society reorganizes around industrial rhythm. You sense how difficult it will be to ever return to something softer. Once time is measured this precisely, it demands obedience everywhere. You hear early debates among reformers and economists. Some argue that strict schedules build discipline and productivity. Others warn they crush the human spirit. Historians still argue whether industrial timekeeping is the foundation of modern prosperity or modern alienation, and you can feel both arguments tugging at you as the bell rings again. As the shift ends, you don't feel relief so much as disorientation. Your body wants rest, but your mind keeps counting. You check the clock even as you leave, as if it might follow you home. Outside, the sky doesn't match your internal sense of time, and that mismatch unsettles you deeply. You lie down later, eyes closed, listening to the echo of bells in your head. Sleep comes in pieces, thin and unsatisfying. And in the quiet between dreams, you realize something chilling. The factory doesn't just control your hours. It's learning how to live inside you. You notice the air before you consciously think about it. It presses into your lungs, heavy and textured, like breathing through cloth soaked in smoke. This is not a metaphor. It's a mainstream historical fact that Victorian factories, especially textile mills, fill the air with cotton lint, coal dust, and chemical vapors. Ventilation exists more in theory than practice. You inhale, and your chest tightens in response, already learning the factory's language. Each breath tastes different depending on where you stand. Near the boilers, it's sharp and metallic, tinged with sulfur. By the looms, it's sweet and dusty, fibers floating like snow that never melts. You watch motes drift in the gaslight, beautiful in a way that feels almost cruel. Someone mutters that it's indoor weather. That's joke number 1, and it sticks because the air really does feel like a climate you're trapped inside. Your eyes sting constantly. Tears form without emotion attached, a reflexive response to irritation. Workers rub their faces with oily hands, making things worse, but there's no clean water nearby and no time to seek it out. You realize how quickly discomfort becomes background noise. After a while, you only notice the air when it gets worse. Coughing is common and oddly communal. You hear it ripple across the room like a second rhythm layered under the machines. Chronic bronchitis, asthma, and what will later be called byssinosis, brown lung, are widespread among textile workers. The term doesn't exist yet, but the symptoms do. You feel them now, a faint wheeze settling in, like a warning whispered by your own body. A quirky tidbit circulates. Some workers believe the dust strengthens lungs, like training weights for breathing. You almost admire the optimism. Historians still argue whether such beliefs are genuine coping mechanisms or deliberate misinformation spread by owners. But standing here, you can see how people cling to any story that makes suffering feel purposeful. The heat compounds everything. Steam engines pump warmth into already crowded spaces, and windows stay shut to protect machines and maintain humidity. Sweat beads on your skin and has nowhere to evaporate. You feel sticky, uncomfortable, constantly aware of your own body. Someone jokes that the factory saves money on baths you sweat enough to count as one. That's joke number 2, and you snort before catching yourself. Smell becomes another layer of fatigue. Oil, human bodies, damp wool, chemicals used to treat fabrics, all blend into something uniquely industrial. You can't escape it. It clings to hair and clothes, follows you home, settles into bedding. Families recognize returning workers by scent before sight. You imagine never being truly clean, no matter how hard you scrub. You notice how breathing becomes strategic. Workers take shallow breaths during intense moments, deeper ones when machines pause. It's unconscious choreography, a way to minimize damage. Children are taught this early, learning where the air is marginally better, which corners offer brief relief. This adaptation impresses and horrifies you in equal measure. Historians still argue whether factory owners fully understood the health consequences of poor air quality. Some certainly ignored warnings. Others claimed ignorance. Medical knowledge is limited, but observation isn't. People can see workers coughing blood, collapsing, aging prematurely. Yet production continues. You feel the moral fog thicken alongside the literal one. A fringe belief whispers through the room. Some workers think illness is caused by moral weakness, not environment. If you're strong, you endure. If you're sick, you've failed somehow. This belief conveniently aligns with profit. You feel its weight pressing down, making people blame themselves for structural harm. You experience a moment of panic when your breath catches unexpectedly. For a second, you imagine suffocating here, unnoticed amid noise and motion. Then it passes, leaving your heart racing. You realize how vulnerable you are. There's no safety net, no sick leave worth mentioning. Missing work means missing pay, which means hunger. You steady yourself and keep going. Breaks offer little relief. Stepping outside briefly feels like emerging from underwater, lungs gulping cool air greedily. The contrast is shocking. You wonder how something as basic as breathing became a luxury. Someone quips that fresh air is addictive, you get used to wanting it. That's joke number 3, and it lands with a hollow laugh. The air follows you into sleep. You lie down later, coughing softly, throat raw. Dust coats your skin even after washing. Dreams fill with fog and spinning shapes, breath labored even in rest. Sleep doesn't restore, it just pauses the damage. You think about progress. Cloth is cheaper, clothing more abundant. People benefit from these factories, even if they never set foot inside one. Historians still argue whether society knowingly traded worker health for material comfort or simply failed to imagine alternatives. Lying there, lungs aching, you feel like the answer matters less than the cost. The next morning or night, time blurs, you return. The air welcomes you back without ceremony, unchanged by your absence. You inhale again because you must, and as your body adapts once more, you understand something quietly devastating. The factory doesn't just shape what you do. It shapes how you breathe, how you sleep, how long you last. You start to notice the rules before you ever see them written down. They live in glances, in sudden silences, in the way workers straighten when certain footsteps approach. This is factory law, a system of discipline that feels both informal and absolute. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Victorian factories enforce strict codes of conduct, backed by fines, dismissal, and sometimes physical punishment. Order is everything. Efficiency depends on it. The rules cover more than you expect. Not just attendance and output, but posture, speech, even facial expression. Talking is discouraged. Laughing is suspicious. Looking tired is a liability. You learn quickly to keep your head down and your hands moving. Someone mutters that the machines don't like eye contact. That's joke number 1, half joke, half warning. Fines are the preferred weapon. Arrive late, lose pay. Make a mistake, lose pay. Damage machinery, lose pay, sometimes more than you earn in a day. Wages are already thin, so these penalties cut deep. You realize how this system shifts risk entirely onto workers. Owners absorb profits. Workers absorb mistakes. Historians still argue whether fines are meant primarily as discipline or as an additional revenue stream, but the effect is the same. Constant anxiety. You see the fine book, thick and well used. Names, infractions, amounts deducted. It reads like a ledger of small humiliations. A woman near you whispers that she once lost a week's wages for a torn thread she didn't cause. You believe her. There's no appeals process worth mentioning. Authority here flows in one direction only. Physical punishment hasn't disappeared, especially for children. A slap, a strike, a shove, quick, efficient, deniable. Owners insist it builds discipline. Reformers call it abuse. You notice how normalized it is. People flinch but don't protest. Survival teaches silence faster than any rulebook. A quirky tidbit circulates. Some factories post moral guidelines alongside work rules, warning against swearing, singing, or improper thoughts. You almost laugh at the idea of policing thoughts in this environment. Almost. That's joke number 2. A breathy exhale at overreach that feels familiar even now. You sense how rules reshape relationships. Workers police each other, reporting infractions to avoid collective punishment. Trust erodes. Cooperation becomes risky when mistakes carry personal cost. You miss the quieter solidarity of shared hardship. Here, hardship is individualized, quantified, fined. You learn about dismissal, the ultimate threat. Being fired isn't just losing a job, it's losing housing, food security, and often community. Company towns tie everything to employment. Historians still argue whether this system is intentionally coercive or simply efficient, but standing under its shadow, efficiency feels like a polite word for control. There are moments of absurdity. A worker fined for excessive coughing, another for inattention, measured subjectively by a supervisor in a bad mood. You joke quietly that breathing is a risky hobby. That's joke number 3, whispered, because humor here is also an infraction. You feel how the rules creep into your body. You stand straighter, move faster, swallow words. Even when supervision fades, the discipline remains. This is the goal, you realize, not constant enforcement, but internalized obedience. The factory wants you to regulate yourself. Some workers resist in tiny ways, slowing down just enough to rest without being noticed, sharing warnings about strict supervisors, hiding tools to create brief pauses. These acts are small, almost invisible, but they matter. They're proof that people aren't machines, no matter how much the system tries to make them so. Reformers visit occasionally, clipboards in hand, expressions grave. Owners clean up temporarily, relax rules just long enough to pass inspections. Historians still argue whether these visits lead to meaningful change or simply teach factories how to hide better. You suspect the latter, watching rules snap back into place as soon as the visitors leave. You reflect on how law here differs from public law. There's no jury, no appeal, no presumption of innocence. Guilt is assumed because disorder is expensive. This private justice system shapes daily life more than distant courts ever could. You feel its weight in every decision, every breath. At the end of the shift, you leave with the rules still buzzing in your head. You catch yourself hesitating before speaking freely, even outside. That's when you realize how deep it goes. Control doesn't end at the factory gate. You lie down later, body aching, mind restless. Sleep should bring escape, but instead you dream of rulebooks and bells, of invisible lines you're terrified to cross. Even in rest, you're careful. As you drift between waking and sleep, one thought lingers. These rules aren't just about work. They're about shaping people, training bodies and minds to fit a new world. Whether that world is progress or something darker remains an open question. One historians still argue over. For now, you close your eyes, hoping tomorrow's fines will be fewer, and knowing hope itself isn't listed in the rulebook. You start to notice how many of the hands around you belong to women. Not just a few, but entire rows of them, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back tightly, bodies leaning into repetitive motion. This is not an accident. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Women make up a substantial portion of the Victorian factory workforce, especially in textiles, because they are perceived as dexterous, reliable, and, crucially, cheaper to employ. You feel the weight of that last word settle uncomfortably. The work demands speed and precision. Fingers fly, tying threads, guiding cloth, adjusting tension. There's skill here, real skill, though it's rarely acknowledged as such. You hear someone remark that women are naturally suited to this labor. That's joke number 1, a bitter one, because it's usually said by people who benefit from the assumption. Skill becomes nature when it justifies lower wages. You notice how the factory blurs traditional roles. Women earn wages, sometimes supporting entire households. This brings a strange mix of empowerment and resentment. Independence grows, but so does scrutiny. Supervisors monitor not just productivity, but behavior, reputation, perceived morality. A woman who talks too much, laughs too freely, or looks too tired risks more than a fine. She risks her name. Sleep suffers differently here. Many women finish shifts only to begin a second round of unpaid labor at home. Cooking, cleaning, caring for children or relatives. Rest becomes fragmented, stolen in minutes rather than hours. Historians still argue whether factory work ultimately improved women's autonomy or deepened exploitation, but watching this double burden unfold, you feel the argument pull hard in one direction. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some factories enforce dress codes meant to discourage vanity, banning ribbons or bright colors. Owners claim it improves focus. You suspect it's more about control. Someone jokes that the machines prefer modesty. That's joke number 2, and it floats through the air like a shared eye roll. You sense the tension around propriety. Mixed-gender workplaces alarm moral reformers, who worry about corruption and disorder. Rules multiply, separate entrances, monitored breaks, strict codes of conduct. Yet proximity breeds familiarity, sometimes solidarity. You see women and men sharing tips, warnings, small kindnesses. These connections feel quietly subversive. Pregnancy is treated as inconvenience. Women work as long as they can, often until physical limits force them out. There's little accommodation, and returning after childbirth isn't guaranteed. You hear whispers of women hiding pregnancies under loose clothing to avoid dismissal. The body becomes something to manage secretly, carefully, under watchful eyes. Health risks compound. Dust and chemicals affect everyone, but women's smaller bodies often show strain sooner. Doctors of the era debate whether factory work damages reproductive health. Historians still argue whether these medical concerns are genuine or laced with paternalistic fear of women stepping outside domestic roles. Standing here, you see both concern and control tangled together. You notice how wages are spent. Some women hand pay packets directly to family members. Others keep them fiercely. Money brings choices, even limited ones. A woman near you jokes that her wages buy more freedom than any sermon. That's joke number 3. Soft but defiant. The factory changes domestic life. Meals shift around shifts. Childcare becomes communal or improvised. Older children watch younger ones, echoing factory hierarchies at home. You see how industrial rhythms seep into private spaces, reshaping family life from the inside out. Resistance takes many forms. Some women join early labor movements, organize strikes, or speak to reformers. Others resist quietly, working just slowly enough, sharing resources, refusing to internalize shame. These acts are risky. Dismissal looms always. Yet the will to push back persists. You reflect on identity. Factory work offers women a public presence, a place in economic life previously denied to many. At the same time, it exposes them to new forms of surveillance and judgment. Progress arrives with conditions attached. Historians still argue whether this era marks liberation or a new cage, and the answer seems to depend on where you stand and what you can afford to lose. As the shift ends, you watch women gather belongings, straighten clothes, prepare to step into another role outside. There's no pause between identities: worker, caretaker, provider. You feel the exhaustion radiating off them, heavy and familiar. Later, as you lie down, you think about how quietly transformative this is. The factory doesn't just produce goods. It produces new expectations, new pressures, new possibilities. Sleep comes late, interrupted by thoughts of hands moving in rhythm, of lives stretched thin across too many demands. And as you drift toward rest, one truth lingers. Women here are not side characters in industrial history. They are central, essential, and carrying far more than their share of the load. Often without recognition, often without rest, and always under the ticking clock that never asks how tired you are. You stop noticing accidents as singular events because they happen too often. They blur into the background noise of the factory, just another interruption in the rhythm of production. This is the grim mainstream fact. Industrial accidents in Victorian factories are frequent, underreported, and often accepted as inevitable. Safety guards are rare, training minimal, and the pressure to keep machines running constant. You feel the tension in your shoulders as you work, knowing one misstep can change everything. You hear the sound first. A sudden shout, a metallic snap, then the machinery grinds to a halt. People freeze, eyes darting, calculating whether they're expected to help or keep working. Often, the answer is to keep going. Injured workers are moved aside quickly, sometimes by co-workers, sometimes by supervisors who seem practiced at it. You notice how efficiently bodies are cleared, as if this is part of the workflow. Hands are the most vulnerable. Fingers catch, sleeves snag, hair pulls tight. You instinctively tuck your own sleeves in closer. Historians still argue whether accident rates decrease significantly after early reforms or whether better reporting simply makes them more visible. But standing here, the danger feels constant regardless of paperwork. A quirky tidbit circulates. Some workers refuse to cut their hair short, believing long hair warns you sooner if it's caught. Others do the opposite, shaving heads to remove the risk entirely. There's no consensus, just personal strategies layered over systemic risk. You find yourself wondering what you'd choose. Injuries are treated with alarming practicality. A finger lost means reassignment if you're lucky. A serious injury often means dismissal. Compensation is rare, charity inconsistent. Families absorb the shock. You hear someone say that the factory doesn't break people. It replaces them. That's joke number one, dark and sharp, and nobody laughs. You notice how pain is normalized. Workers shrug off cuts and burns, binding them quickly and returning to tasks. Stopping means falling behind, and falling behind invites punishment. You realize how this environment trains people to ignore their own bodies, to distrust pain as a signal. Sleep later becomes restless, body replaying ignored warnings in throbbing echoes. Children are especially at risk. Their small size helps productivity but magnifies danger. You remember the girl from earlier sections and feel a knot form in your chest. Historians still argue whether children are inherently more accident-prone or simply more expendable in factory logic. The distinction feels academic when you watch them work inches from harm. Some accidents become stories, passed down as cautionary tales. A man whose sleeve caught and pulled him in. A woman who slipped and vanished beneath belts. Details shift with each retelling, but the moral remains. Be careful, but don't slow down. It's an impossible instruction. A fringe belief emerges. Some workers think accidents happen in clusters like storms. When one occurs, people grow tense, expecting more. You feel it now. The air tight, movements careful yet rushed. Superstition fills gaps where safety measures should be. Official records downplay severity. Owners label injuries as minor to avoid scrutiny. You sense how language becomes another tool of erasure. Historians still argue whether this minimization is conscious deceit or cultural blindness, but either way, it shapes what counts as acceptable loss. You witness a near miss. A sleeve brushes a gear and pulls free at the last second. Your heart jumps. The worker laughs shakily and keeps going. Someone quips that the machine just wanted attention. That's joke number two, fragile humor clinging to relief. You reflect on how accidents affect sleep. Fear follows you home, replaying moments of danger in vivid detail. You lie awake imagining alternate outcomes. Bodies caught, screams swallowed by noise. Even when you drift off, dreams jerk you awake again. Rest becomes shallow, haunted. Reformers push for guards, limits, inspections. Some changes arrive slowly, unevenly. Owners argue that safety costs money and reduces efficiency. Workers argue that limbs cost more. Historians still argue whether early safety reforms emerge from moral awakening or economic calculation, but progress feels painfully incremental. You notice something else. Solidarity often flares after accidents. People share food, cover shifts, raise small funds. These moments of care puncture the factory's indifference. They don't undo harm, but they remind you that people here still see each other. As the shift ends, you leave with heightened awareness, every movement deliberate. Outside, your body finally relaxes, muscles unclenching in the quiet. You feel exhausted, not just from work, but from constant vigilance. Later, as you settle into sleep, you think about how easily accidents fade from official memory but linger in bodies and dreams. The factory may not count them carefully, but the workers do, tallying losses in scars and absences. And as darkness thickens, you understand why accidents become invisible. To truly see them would mean questioning the system that produces them. It's easier, quieter to look away and let the machines keep moving. You step outside the factory gates and into streets that look almost reassuring. Rows of identical houses line up neatly, brick clean, windows uniform, everything suggesting order and care. This is the company town illusion. The mainstream historical fact is that many Victorian industrialists build housing for workers, presenting it as benevolence while tightly controlling rents, behavior, and loyalty. At first glance, it feels like relief. Shelter is close. The walk to work is short. You tell yourself this might be better. Inside the house, space is tight but functional. Rooms serve multiple purposes: sleeping, eating, living, often all at once. Privacy is rare. You share beds, sometimes in shifts, one body rising as another sinks in. This hotbedding isn't universal, but it's common enough to be unremarkable. Sleep becomes something borrowed and returned, not owned. Rent is deducted directly from wages. This convenience comes at a price. Lose your job, lose your home. The connection is immediate and unforgiving. Historians still argue whether company housing improves living standards or simply extends employer control into private life. Standing in this room, you feel how thin the wall is between work and survival. The streets are watched, not always by guards, but by expectation. Behavior matters. Noise complaints, gatherings, even guests can draw attention. Rules spill outward from the factory, shaping evenings and weekends. You realize how discipline follows you home, softer but persistent. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some company towns enforce curfews, especially for young workers. Bells ring not just for shifts but for bedtime. You almost laugh at the idea of being told when to sleep after such long days. That's joke number one, weary and ironic. Shops belong to the company too. You buy food, tools, and clothing where you're told, often at inflated prices. Credit is easy to get and hard to escape. Debt settles in quietly, making departure feel impossible. Someone jokes that the company store sells hope in small portions. That's joke number two, and it lands because hope here is always rationed. Social life bends around schedules. Gatherings happen early, end quickly. Exhaustion shapes conversation. You notice how little energy remains for conflict or organizing. This is no accident. Historians still argue whether company towns are designed explicitly to suppress labor unrest or simply to maximize efficiency. But the result is the same: control without constant force. There are moments of genuine community. Shared hardship creates bonds. Neighbors watch children, exchange food, care for the sick. You feel warmth here, real and earned. Complicates the narrative. Not everything is imposed. People build lives within constraints. Yet the illusion cracks easily. A family disappears overnight after a dismissal. Their house is empty by morning, windows dark. No farewell, no explanation. You understand how fragile belonging is. Home is conditional. Sleep in company housing is shallow. Noise travels through thin walls. Coughing, crying, arguments, laughter. You learn to sleep through almost anything, a skill that feels less like adaptation and more like surrender. Dreams tangle with factory sounds, bells echoing even here. A fringe belief circulates. Some workers think the houses are built to make you forget the world beyond, to shrink your imagination. You stare at the narrow streets and wonder if that's true. Distance feels abstract when your entire life fits between gate and door. Reformers praise model villages as evidence of industrial kindness. Owners host tours. Historians still argue whether these showcases reflect reality or mask exploitation. You imagine being led through these streets by daylight, everything tidy and quiet, while the real life happens in shadows and fatigue. You feel the psychological effect of proximity. Work is never far enough away to stop thinking about. You hear the factory at night, a low hum carried on the air. It feels like sleeping beside a living thing that never rests. Even on days off, the rhythm persists. As evening deepens, you sit on a step and watch lights flicker on, one by one. People settle into routines shaped by necessity. There's comfort in predictability, even when it's imposed. You feel conflicted, grateful for shelter yet uneasy about the cost. When you finally lie down, you measure rest in minutes before the next bell. Sleep arrives in fragments, stitched together by exhaustion. You dream of streets that go on forever, all leading back to the same gate. And as you drift off, you understand the illusion fully. The company town offers safety with strings attached, community under supervision, rest that never quite reaches deep. It feels like care until you imagine trying to leave and realize how much of yourself you'd have to give up to do it. You feel hunger long before you think about food. It settles in as a dull ache, steady and familiar, like another background noise of factory life. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward. Victorian factory workers survive on cheap, calorie-dense diets designed to fuel labor, not health. Meals are quick, repetitive, and chosen for cost and convenience rather than pleasure. You eat to keep moving, not to enjoy. Breakfast is often bread and weak tea. The tea is strong enough to stimulate, bitter enough to suppress appetite. Sugar, when available, is precious. You notice how everyone guards their cup like medicine. Someone jokes that tea is the only thing holding the industry together. That's joke number one, and you don't argue. Lunch is brief. You eat standing, sitting on the floor, or leaning against a wall. Meat appears rarely, more often as flavor than substance. Stews stretch small portions to feed many mouths. You chew quickly, conscious of the clock, swallowing before your body is ready. Eating becomes mechanical, just another task to complete efficiently. You learn about adulteration. Bread patted with chalk or alum. Milk thinned with water. These practices are widespread, driven by profit and poor regulation. Historians still argue whether adulteration is mostly a result of greed or necessity in overcrowded cities. But either way, it leaves bodies undernourished and suspicious of what they consume. Fatigue drives dietary choices. Heavy foods sit badly in tired stomachs, so people favor what's easy to digest, or at least what they believe is. A quirky tidbit circulates. Some workers swear by onions as a cure-all, claiming they ward off illness and restore strength. You add it to your mental list of industrial folk medicine. Alcohol appears as both comfort and coping mechanism. Beer is safer than water in many places and provides calories. Drinking blurs the edge of exhaustion, at least temporarily. Reformers condemn it. Workers defend it. Historians still argue whether alcohol use is a cause of industrial misery or a response to it. Standing here, you feel how blurred that line really is. Sleep and food intertwine. Go to bed hungry, and rest comes fitful. Eat too much, and digestion keeps you awake. You experiment unconsciously, adjusting portions, timing, hoping to find balance. There's no guidance beyond trial and error costs energy you don't have. Stimulants become essential. Tea, coffee, tobacco, all serve to keep eyes open and hands steady. You notice how often people reach for pipes or snuff during breaks. Someone quips that nicotine is cheaper than sleep. That's joke number two, dry and accurate. You reflect on how malnutrition hides itself. People keep working long after reserves are gone, fueled by routine and pressure. Doctors of the era note weakness and nervous complaints without fully connecting them to diet. Historians still argue whether poor nutrition or overwork plays a larger role in early industrial illness, but watching bodies sag by mid-shift, you suspect it's the combination. Communal eating, when it happens, feels precious. Shared bread, a pot of stew, quiet conversation. These moments restore something intangible. You realize food isn't just fuel. It's one of the few remaining social anchors. Without it, isolation deepens. You hear debates about factory canteens. Some owners introduce them to improve productivity. Others resist the cost. Reformers see potential for better health. Critics see another way to control workers' time. Historians still argue whether these initiatives are genuine welfare or strategic investment. You chew thoughtfully, aware that even kindness here often has strings. As night falls, cravings intensify. Sugar, fat, warmth, anything comforting. You watch people spend precious coins on small treats, moments of pleasure carved out of scarcity. You understand completely. Comfort is rare currency. Later, as you prepare to sleep, your stomach growls softly. You weigh whether to eat more or conserve food for morning. This calculation follows you into bed, an undercurrent of anxiety that keeps true rest at bay. Sleep comes shallow, interrupted by dreams of endless bread lines and teacups that never fill. You wake feeling both full and empty, fed enough to function, deprived enough to ache. The cycle repeats. Eat to work, work to eat. Historians still argue whether industrial diets improve or worsen overall health compared to earlier periods, but lying there, you feel the cost in your bones. As you rise for another shift, you sip tea, brace yourself, and step back into the rhythm. Food will keep you moving. Sleep will keep you barely human. Between them, you survive. You notice them because they don't quite belong. Their clothes are cleaner, their hands softer, their expressions a careful mix of concern and calculation. These are the moral reformers and meddlers, stepping cautiously into factory life with notebooks, sermons, and strong opinions. The mainstream historical fact is that Victorian Britain sees a surge of reform movements, religious groups, social investigators, doctors, and politicians, attempting to document and improve industrial conditions. Whether they help or hinder depends on where you stand. Some arrive with genuine compassion. They tour mills, interview workers, and publish reports filled with shocking descriptions of long hours, child labor, and dangerous conditions. You can feel the relief workers experience when someone finally seems to notice. Being seen, even briefly, matters. It validates pain that's been normalized for too long. Others arrive with agendas. Religious reformers worry less about broken bodies and more about broken morals. They preach sobriety, punctuality, and obedience, insisting that spiritual reform must precede material improvement. You listen politely, exhausted, wondering when anyone will preach shorter shifts. Someone whispers that sermons are lighter than coal but just as hard to breathe through. That's joke number one, quiet and sharp. Factory owners often welcome reformers. Selectively. They clean up floors, shorten shifts temporarily, hide the youngest workers. Inspections become performances. Historians still argue whether these visits produce meaningful change or simply teach factories how to stage compliance. Watching the sudden order snap back into chaos once visitors leave, you feel skeptical. Doctors play a complicated role. Some document lung disease, deformities, and exhaustion with alarming clarity. Others blame weakness, heredity, or moral failure. Medical language is evolving, and so is responsibility. Historians still argue whether early industrial medicine protects workers or shields industry by framing harm as unavoidable. You hear about factory acts passed by Parliament, laws limiting child labor hours, mandating schooling, improving safety. On paper, they sound promising. In practice, enforcement is uneven. Inspectors are few. Factories are many. Owners exploit loopholes. You sense how law lags behind reality, always a step late. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some reformers believe music in factories improves morale and productivity. A few mills experiment with it. You imagine machines accompanied by hymns and almost laugh. That's joke number two, because it sounds soothing until you remember volume levels. Workers respond with mixed feelings. Some welcome attention. Others distrust outsiders who speak for them without listening. Being helped can feel like being managed. You understand this tension deeply. Change imposed from above often misses what matters most on the ground. You notice how reform language shapes narratives. Terms like deserving poor and idle poor circulate, sorting people into categories. Assistance becomes conditional. Historians still argue whether these distinctions advance reform or entrench stigma, but you feel their weight press down on already tired shoulders. There are moments of genuine progress. Shorter hours for children, mandatory schooling, slightly safer machines. These changes matter even if they arrive slowly. You don't dismiss them. You just notice how much remains untouched. Adult hours, wages, control. Some reformers clash openly with owners, risking reputation and funding. Others compromise, believing gradual change is better than none. Historians still argue whether incrementalism saves lives or delays justice. Standing here, you wish the debate could pause long enough to let people sleep. Workers begin to tell their own stories. Testimonies appear in pamphlets and hearings, raw and direct. You feel a surge of recognition hearing familiar struggles spoken aloud. Voice becomes a form of resistance. Not enough, but something. You sense the unintended consequences too. Improved conditions in some factories push exploitation elsewhere. Regulation drives production to places with fewer rules. Progress shifts harm rather than eliminating it. This realization settles heavily. As reformers leave, notebooks full, promises made, you return to work. The machines haven't changed. Neither has the bell. Yet something lingers, a crack in inevitability. Someone has questioned the system openly, and that matters. Later, lying down, you think about intention versus outcome. Good intentions can soothe consciences without soothing bodies. Still, without them, nothing changes at all. Historians still argue whether reformers are heroes, meddlers, or both. You suspect the answer depends on whether their efforts translate into fewer hours, safer air, deeper sleep. As you drift toward rest, you hold onto a cautious hope, not for salvation, but for pressure, for cracks widening slowly. Change here is never sudden. It creeps forward, carried by tired people and imperfect allies, inching toward something slightly less brutal than yesterday. You feel resistance before you see it. It moves quietly through the factory, threaded between shifts and whispered during breaks. This is not open rebellion, not yet. Something subtler. The mainstream historical fact is that Victorian workers resist industrial conditions in countless small ways long before large unions gain power. These acts are easy to miss unless you're watching closely. You notice the pauses first. Machines slow ever so slightly when supervision eases. Hands rest a fraction longer between motions. These micro-delays are intentional, calibrated to avoid punishment. You realize how much skill it takes to resist without being caught. Someone jokes that slowing down is an art form. That's joke number one, soft and proud. Information travels underground. Warnings about harsh foremen, upcoming inspections, or sudden rule changes spread faster than official notices. You watch workers exchange looks, nods, subtle gestures. This is solidarity adapted to surveillance. Trust builds in fragments. Night offers cover. After dark, away from factory eyes, conversations deepen. Grievances surface. Stories align. You sense anger sharpening into something more focused. Historians still argue whether night gatherings are primarily social or political in origin. But here, the line blurs. Exhaustion makes honesty easier. A quirky tidbit emerges. Some workers deliberately misalign machines just enough to force repairs, creating unscheduled breaks. It's risky, but effective. You imagine the careful calculation involved. Resistance here requires technical knowledge and nerve. Songs carry messages. Simple tunes embed complaints, warnings, hopes. Sung softly, they pass unnoticed by those who don't listen. You hum along without realizing it, the melody sticking. Music becomes memory. Women play key roles, organizing quietly, coordinating absences, sharing resources. Their networks extend beyond the factory into homes and streets. Historians still argue whether women's resistance is underdocumented or deliberately minimized. Watching this unfold, you suspect both. Children participate too in their own ways, passing notes, distracting supervisors, covering for each other. Their solidarity is instinctive, learned early. You feel a mix of pride and sadness at how quickly they adapt. Open defiance is rare but electric. A sudden walkout, a refusal to restart machines after an accident. These moments are risky and often short-lived, crushed by dismissals or force. But they linger in memory. You hear people recount them like legends. A fringe belief circulates. Some workers think machines can be taught, through collective behavior, that synchronized resistance confuses systems designed for isolated compliance. Whether true or not, the idea empowers. It reframes people as agents, not cogs. Historians still argue whether early resistance meaningfully improves conditions or merely delays exploitation. The answer depends on scale and time. Immediate victories are small, but cumulative pressure builds. You feel it gathering, slow and steady. You notice how resistance affects sleep. There's fear of retaliation, of unemployment, but also energy. Purpose sharpens exhaustion. You lie awake planning, replaying conversations, imagining outcomes. Rest becomes lighter but more hopeful. Reformers sometimes intersect with resistance, awkwardly. Workers use reports and laws as leverage, citing regulations when convenient. Knowledge becomes a tool. You see how information empowers even when enforcement is weak. Trust is fragile. Informers exist. Suspicion shadows gatherings. You learn to weigh words carefully. Silence becomes strategic. Historians still argue whether fear fractures solidarity more than repression. You feel both pressing in. As dawn approaches after a long night of talk, you feel strangely awake despite exhaustion. Something is shifting. It's not revolution, not yet, but alignment. People begin to see themselves as a group rather than isolated sufferers. When the bell rings, you return to work with new awareness. The machines sound the same, but your relationship to them has changed. You're no longer just enduring. You're observing, calculating, connecting. Later, as you settle into bed, plans and worries swirl. Sleep comes in fits, but when it does, it carries dreams of synchronized movement, of hands stopping together, of silence spreading through the factory like a held breath. And as darkness thickens, you understand resistance here isn't loud. It's patient. It grows in whispers and glances, in shared fatigue and quiet courage. It's the sound of people remembering they are not alone, even when the machines try to convince them otherwise. You find yourself standing between two stories that refuse to agree with each other. One hums with optimism, smokestacks as symbols of progress, factories as engines of prosperity. The other aches with exhaustion, injury, and shortened lives. This tension defines the era. The mainstream historical fact is that the Industrial Revolution dramatically increases overall economic output and living standards over the long term, even as it imposes severe short-term suffering on workers like you. You feel that contradiction in your own body. Wages are steadier than rural day labor once was. Food is more predictable even if it's dull. Goods once unimaginable are now within reach. Yet every improvement seems to demand a physical toll. Historians still argue whether industrial misery is a temporary growing pain or an avoidable cruelty, and you sense how easily theory ignores lived experience. Supporters of industry point to falling prices and expanding markets. They argue that factories pull people from subsistence into stability. You understand the logic. A predictable paycheck feels safer than a failed harvest. Still, safety loses meaning when it costs sleep, lungs, and limbs. A quirky tidbit circulates in public debates. Some Victorian economists compare workers to batteries, temporarily drained but ultimately replaceable. The metaphor unsettles you. Sufficient, bloodless, and revealing. That's joke number one, dark and dry. You think at least batteries get recharged. Critics of industry highlight overcrowded cities, pollution, and shortened lifespans. They cite burial records and hospital wards. You've seen those wards. You've carried people there. Numbers feel different when they have faces. Reformers and owners clash in newspapers and parliament. Arguments bounce between morality and necessity. Some claim harsh conditions forge discipline and national strength. Others argue they erode the very people progress depends on. Historians still argue whether cruelty is intrinsic to early industrialization or amplified by unchecked capitalism. Listening to the debate, you wonder why endurance is always demanded from the same bodies. You notice how language shapes judgment. Words like progress and efficiency sanitize harm. Brutality sounds emotional, exaggerated. You live in the space between them where both are true. Progress arrives, but it's sharp-edged. There are beneficiaries beyond owners. Skilled workers sometimes rise, becoming foremen or mechanics. Their lives improve noticeably. You watch them walk differently, sleep longer. Mobility exists, but it's narrow. Historians still argue how representative these success stories are. You suspect they're highlighted precisely because they're rare. You also see how industrial wealth funds innovation, sanitation, transport, medicine. Some improvements trickle back to workers eventually. The timeline matters. Suffering now for benefits later feels unjust when you might not live to see later. A fringe argument floats around worker circles. That industry could have developed more slowly, with safeguards, if profit weren't prioritized. It's impossible to prove. Historians still argue whether alternative paths existed or whether competition made brutality inevitable. You imagine a gentler pace and wonder who decided it was impossible. Comparisons emerge. People point to regions with different labor laws or traditions. Outcomes vary. This suggests choices matter. The system isn't a force of nature. It's built and maintained by people. That realization sticks. You sense how this debate affects identity. Are you a sacrifice for progress or a victim of greed? The answer shapes how you endure. Seeing yourself as necessary can numb pain. Seeing yourself as exploited can fuel anger. Neither brings sleep easily. As night falls, you replay arguments you've overheard. They echo alongside machine rhythms in your head. Sleep becomes a negotiation between belief and fatigue. You try to believe the suffering has purpose. Some nights it works. In quieter moments, you acknowledge complexity. Industry brings both harm and opportunity. Simplistic judgments feel inadequate. Yet complexity shouldn't excuse cruelty. Historians still argue how to balance these truths, and you live the imbalance. Before drifting off, you picture future generations debating your life in abstract terms. Charts, averages, outcomes. You hope they remember the texture, the noise, the dust, the exhaustion. Progress measured without memory feels hollow. You close your eyes holding two truths at once. That the world is changing, and that change is costing you dearly. The factory stands as both monument and warning, humming through the night, asking bodies to pay for tomorrow with today. You feel it before you can name it. The quiet, cumulative toll settling into your body. This is not the sharp pain of an accident or the shock of a single long shift. It's slower, heavier. The mainstream historical fact is that prolonged factory labor during the Victorian era leads to chronic health problems, including respiratory disease, joint damage, and premature aging. The body keeps score even when the mind tries not to. Your breathing changes first. Each inhale carries a faint rasp, a reminder of years spent in lint-filled air and coal smoke. You notice how stairs feel steeper now. Sleep comes with coughing fits that break the night into fragments. Historians still argue whether factory pollution or urban crowding is the primary cause of these ailments. But from inside your chest, the distinction feels academic. Your hands tell their own story. Fingers stiffen, knuckles swell. Repetitive motions carve patterns of pain into joints. You wake up already sore. Stretching helps briefly. Then the bell rings. That's joke number one. Your body stretches, but your schedule never does. Your posture shifts. You hunch unconsciously, shaped by machines set at the wrong height. Mirrors reveal changes you didn't notice day to day. You look older than your years. Many do. Age becomes a misleading measure here. A quirky tidbit surfaces in worker lore. Some believe certain aches predict weather changes better than barometers. Knees signal rain. Lungs warn of cold. You half believe it because your body always knows before the sky does. Nutrition compounds damage. Diets heavy on bread and tea lack protein and vitamins. Bones weaken. Teeth suffer. You feel brittle. Historians still argue how much poor diet versus overwork drives decline. But the combination is unforgiving. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow. Pain interrupts dreams. You shift positions constantly, searching for comfort. Rest stops being restorative and becomes merely pause. Night no longer heals, it just delays. Mental strain deepens the toll. Anxiety about injury, dismissal, or illness keeps your thoughts racing. Exhaustion dulls joy. Humor helps sometimes. That's joke number two. you tell yourself worrying burns calories, so at least something productive is happening. Accidents accelerate decline. Even minor injuries heal poorly under constant strain. Cuts reopen. Bruises linger. Returning to work too soon is common. There's no margin for recovery. Historians still argue whether employers knowingly exploit this or simply accept it as unavoidable. From your perspective, the result is the same. Women face additional burdens. Pregnancy and childbirth intersect dangerously with factory labor. Recovery time is minimal. Bodies are expected to endure without pause. You witness strength stretched to its limits. Children grow into adults already worn down. You recognize the posture, the cough, the fatigue in teenagers. The future arrives pre-damaged. This realization settles heavily. Some workers find small remedies. Warm compresses, herbal salves, alcohol. Each offers temporary relief. Dependence creeps in. You understand why. Pain demands answers, even flawed ones. Doctors vary in response. Some advise rest that's impossible. Others dismiss complaints. A few advocate change. Historians still argue whether medical recognition of industrial disease emerges too slowly or as fast as evidence allows. Waiting for consensus doesn't ease tonight's ache. As years pass, you notice colleagues disappearing. Illness, injury, death. New faces replace them. The cycle continues. Loss becomes normalized. That's joke number 3. Bitter. You joke about factory churn as promotion to fresh lungs. Lying down, you inventory your body the way others count wages. What still works? What hurts? What's changed forever? This accounting becomes ritual. Yet you adapt. Humans do. You learn which pains to ignore, which demand attention. You conserve energy. You plan movements carefully. Survival becomes skilled labor in itself. As sleep finally pulls you under, you sense how deeply work has reshaped you. Not just muscles and bones, but expectations. You no longer assume comfort is normal. Rest feels earned, fragile. The factory may sleep briefly, but its imprint remains, etched into your body, carried forward into every breath. Even in stillness, the work continues, remembered by flesh long after machines fall silent. You notice the difference immediately. The subtle, almost disorienting, the machines are quiet. Not gone, not dismantled, just resting. This is the hour when even industry exhales. The mainstream historical fact is that factories rarely stop entirely in the Victorian era, but brief pauses, maintenance windows, Sundays, early dawn, offer rare moments of silence. In that silence, you hear yourself again. Without the constant clatter, your thoughts stretch out. The factory looms differently when it isn't roaring. It looks less like a beast and more like a monument. Brick, iron, intention. You walk past it slowly, noticing details usually blurred by haste. Historians still argue whether workers experience these pauses as relief or anxiety, because silence can feel unfamiliar after years of noise. Dawn creeps in softly. Light spills over roofs and chimneys, catching dust in the air. The city seems almost gentle. You breathe deeper, recognizing how shallow your breaths usually are. That's joke number 1, faint and tired. Turns out your lungs know how to relax, they've just been busy. You think about echoes. Even when machines stop, their rhythm lingers in your body. Muscles twitch in remembered patterns. Sleep sometimes sinks to phantom belts and wheels. This is industrial memory embedded deeper than thought. A quirky tidbit surfaces from older workers. Some swear they can tell which factory they worked in years later just by listening to silence, because each one leaves a different echo behind. You believe it. Places imprint people. You reflect on everything carried forward: skills, habits, damage, resilience. The factory shapes more than wages. It reshapes time, identity, expectation. Historians still argue whether industrial labor creates a new kind of human, disciplined and clock-bound. Standing here, you feel that discipline humming even at rest. There's pride too, complicated but real. You've endured. You've learned. You've contributed to something larger, even if you didn't choose its terms. This pride doesn't erase harm, but it coexists with it. Humans are good at holding contradictions. You think about the future. Reforms inch forward. Laws tighten. Machines improve. Conditions change slowly. Not enough for you, perhaps, but enough that someone later may breathe easier. That thought offers a thin comfort. As night returns, the factory will wake again. You know this. Tomorrow repeats. Yet this quiet hour matters. It reminds you that the noise isn't eternal, that even the loudest systems pause. Historians still argue whether the Industrial Revolution ultimately liberates or diminishes humanity. The answer stretches beyond statistics into moments like this, when work stops and a tired person stands still, listening to their own breath. You turn toward home. Sleep waits, imperfect but necessary. The machines will recall you soon enough. For now, there is dim light, cooling air, and the fragile peace of a world briefly unworked. You lie down carrying the echoes with you, but softer now. The factory sleeps. You try to follow. Your breathing slows as the last images fade. The machines grow distant, their edges blurred, their weight less pressing. The night feels thicker, kinder. You no longer measure time by bells or shifts, only by the steady rise and fall of your chest. You remind yourself that rest doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Even shallow sleep counts. Even quiet lying still is a kind of repair. The body listens when you give it permission to pause. Thoughts drift without urgency now. Faces, sounds, fragments of history pass gently through your mind, no longer demanding attention. They soften, dissolving into something more abstract, less sharp. You're safe here, removed from the noise, the dust, the endless motion. The world beyond this moment can wait. Nothing needs fixing tonight. Nothing needs proving. As sleep settles in, your muscles loosen one by one. The tension you've been holding without noticing finally releases. The past grows quiet. Tomorrow stays far away. Stay here in the stillness. Let the echoes fade completely. Let the night do what it can.